everyone, and welcome to ITMO, which stands for Instant Transformation Moment. And we call it that because we use the 3Q method to activate spiritual intelligence, which works almost instantly to shift you from ego to soul and find your spiritual intelligence. But before we use the 3Q method together and experience our spiritual intelligence together, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the topic for today's event, which is the truths that only the soul understands. And when I talk about the spiritual truths that only the soul understands, I'm talking about things like you are divine, thou art that, death does not exist, be your true self, and then the self does not exist, right? The ego just thinks that's a contradiction, doesn't understand. You are not born and you do not die. Love is the source, love is your nature. The ego misunderstands all these spiritual truths. You know, when you say you are divine to the ego and the ego hears it, the ego just thinks, oh, that means I, the ego, am divine. Doesn't mean that at all. You know, it means when the ego is not, then the divine is realized. So to help me explain these truths that only the soul understands, I want to share my screen and go to this article called The Location of the Soul. And you should be seeing it on your screens now. The location of the soul. So let's just read a bit from this article. The soul is the existential self, or the true self, in contrast to the ego, which is the body-mind self. The soul is located at the subject pole of attention, whereas the ego is located at the object pole of attention. If you look at this diagram here on the page now, you can see on the right-hand side we have the object pole of attention, states of body and mind, thoughts and emotions, and on the left we have the subject pole of attention, which is consciousness itself. And so being the soul means to be consciousness itself, and being the ego means to be the body and mind, identified with thoughts and emotions. So when the ego hears you are divine, the ego thinks, oh, my body and mind, my thoughts and emotions, they're divine. Cool. Doesn't mean that. It means only when you're being the true self, consciousness itself, then you understand what's meant by you are divine. And it means not you as an individuated soul, but the nature of the soul is the nature of the divine. The nature of the soul is apparently individuated consciousness, and the divine is non-individuated consciousness. But only the soul can understand non-individuated consciousness. The ego can't understand that. So you first have to be the soul to understand all these sayings. So let's talk about how you shift from ego to soul and activate your spiritual intelligence. Because only from that position will all these spiritual truths be obvious. So I'm going to share with you now a PowerPoint presentation which will take us through the method of how to shift from ego to soul and activate your spiritual intelligence. So this symbol represents the three dimensions of intelligence, IQ, EQ, and SQ, and it opens out into the twin poles of attention. We have the subject pole and the object pole of attention. So as we've just seen, at the object pole, are everything you're aware of, thoughts and emotions and perceptions, your body and mind. And at the subject pole is simply consciousness itself. And when you identify with the object pole of attention, that's called being the ego. So when you believe I am my thoughts and emotions, you're being the ego. And when you identify with consciousness itself, when you are aware that I am the field of consciousness itself, that's called being the soul. And so that's the location at the subject pole. So the whole question is how to shift from ego to soul, because that is how you activate spiritual intelligence, and that's how you understand the spiritual truths that only the soul understands. So what you see on the page now is the human operating system. In any moment of time, you are either being the ego or being the soul, one or the other. The only exceptions are in deep sleep, when you're being at neither pole of attention, or in transcendental intelligence, which is the ultimate dimension of intelligence beyond SQ, then you're also not being either ego or soul, because you're located prior to the mechanism of attention altogether. But in the absence of those two exceptions, deep sleep and transcendental intelligence, this is your operating system. You're either being the ego or being the soul. So the question is, how do you shift from ego to soul? And the answer, of course, is you have to go through this mechanism of attention, which is what links ego and soul. Now, the mechanism of attention is extremely complex, but fortunately, there's a very rapid way through it from object to subject pole. And this rapid method is called the 3Q portal. And it has 3 simple steps: notice, feel, and be. And when you perform those 3 steps in the way that I'm about to describe, you shift from ego to soul, from false self to true self, which is what activates your spiritual intelligence. So let's do these 3 steps now, so that we shift from ego to soul, and so that you can then understand the truths that only the soul understands. So step 1 is notice. So the question is, notice what? Well, you simply notice that this is your operating system. You're either being the ego or you're being the soul, one or the other. There's no other alternatives, with the exception of deep sleep or transcendental intelligence. So notice simply is to remind yourself, step 1, notice, is just to remind yourself that there's more to existence than just your thoughts and emotions and perceptions, because the ego forgets this completely. The ego becomes immersed in thoughts and emotions, identifies with them, and forgets that I am the one who is aware of my thoughts and emotions. So the ego forgets all about the subject pole of attention. And that's why we have step 1, notice. Just remind yourself that there is such a thing as the subject pole, consciousness itself, which is who you are. Step 2 is feel. And here's where we get to feel what it's like at the subject pole as the soul. And for this step, we use a breathing technique. So I'm going to go through the breathing technique now, and you can follow my description with me and experience step 2. So bring your attention to your breathing. Just find that still point at the end of the in-breath when you're neither breathing in or breathing out. Did you find that still point there? You don't have to hold your breath. In fact, it's important not to hold your breath. Just find that still point that's naturally there at the short pause in the breathing when you're neither breathing in or breathing out. Just find it again. Okay, and now feel what it feels like in that pause in the breathing. Can you feel what it feels like in that pause in the breathing at the end of the in-breath? How does it feel for you? It feels peaceful, doesn't it? And that's because the mind has paused when the breathing pauses. Just notice that for yourself. Find that still point again in the breathing at the end of the in-breath. And notice what happens to the thinking process in that still point when you're feeling peace. The thinking process pauses as well, doesn't it? That's why you feel peace, because it's the thinking that introduces a disturbance. So this is step 2, feel. You're just feeling that peaceful feeling. But we have a further step to go, which is be. So find that still point again at the end of the in-breath, feel that peace there, and then I'll lead us to step 3. So as you feel that peace at the end of the in-breath in the still point, move to step 3, be that peaceful feeling. That means to allow that peaceful feeling to go all over your body and mind. So at the end of the in-breath, you feel that peaceful feeling in the still point of at the end of the in-breath. And then as you breathe out, you allow that peaceful feeling to go all over your body and mind. So that's step 3, be. So take a look around, just confirm for yourself that I am now being consciousness itself. I'm being the field of consciousness. And thoughts and emotions may continue to arise, but I'm simply the witness of those thoughts and emotions. I'm no longer being my body and mind. I'm no longer being my thoughts and emotions. I'm simply the field of awareness within which the body and mind and thoughts and emotions arise. So I am consciousness itself right now, feeling peaceful regardless of what happens at the object pole, regardless of what my thoughts and emotions are. I'm feeling peaceful because I'm the consciousness of my thoughts and emotions. So this is called using your spiritual intelligence. And in this position, you have access to all the qualities and capabilities of the soul. Not simply peacefulness, but also joy and love and integrity and creativity. All these soul qualities spontaneously become available. So from this position, you can now understand what only the soul understands, because you're now being the soul. So when you hear a phrase like "you are divine," the soul understands what's meant, because the soul knows that, yes, consciousness itself, even though right now it's an individuated consciousness that I'm aware of as the individual soul, nevertheless I understand that my individual soul inheres in the divine. The divine is non-individuated, whereas the soul is individuated. But we're both consciousness itself, which is the divine. The non-individuated consciousness is the divine, and the individuated consciousness is the soul. So only the soul understands what's meant by "you are divine," because the ego mistakenly thinks that means the ego is divine. You know, my body, mind, my thoughts and emotions, they're all divine. It's not true. The ego is not divine. This is a famous misunderstanding that has caused a great deal of trouble on Earth for millennia. And that's why we have to clear up this problem. Similarly, thou art that, a very famous spiritual truth, meaning, you are the divine, you are God. Only the soul understands this, the ego does not. The soul understands that thou art that means ultimately there is only consciousness, not even a sense of individuation. Even that goes. The soul can understand this, but the ego can't. What about be your true self, but the self does not exist? To the ego, this just sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? Just sounds like you're contradicting yourself. Be your true self, but the self doesn't exist. It's like, what? Now, the soul understands this, because the soul is the true self, and the ego is the false self. So when you get to being the soul, being consciousness itself, then as the soul, you're able to understand this saying of there is no self, because from the position of being the true self, you're able to intuit that the apparently individuated consciousness is only been separated from non-individuated consciousness. So non-individuated consciousness, transcendental intelligence, corresponds to the self does not exist. There is no self. But only the true self can understand this. So these are different levels of experience and understanding. The soul dimension and the transcendental dimension. The soul can understand this. It's like the difference between Newtonian physics and nuclear physics. Newtonian physics tells us that physical objects exist, and quantum physics tells us physical objects don't exist, there's only energy. So there appears to be a contradiction between Newtonian physics and nuclear physics. But there's not actually a contradiction, they're just different levels of experience and understanding. Similarly, be your true self and the self doesn't exist are not contradictions, they're just different levels of experience and understanding. Another spiritual truth that only the soul understands is you are not born and do not die. And the ego misunderstands this and says, what do you mean I'm not born? Of course I'm born. How could I be alive if I wasn't born? But the meaning of you are not born is to say that consciousness itself is not born. Only the body-mind is born, which inheres in consciousness, right? But consciousness itself, the soul, is not born and does not die. Consciousness itself pre-exists birth and exists beyond birth. So what's born is the mortal body-mind, which is born and therefore dies. Similarly, love is the source, love is your true nature. The ego misunderstands this, and the ego thinks, yes, I'm a very loving person, it's very true. I know I'm very loving, yes, I feel love a lot, I especially love my partner, and so on. But this is not the meaning of love is your true nature. The ego's experience of love is fluctuating and temporary and variable, depending on their mood. They feel love or not, right? So for the ego, it's not true that love is your true nature. For the ego, love is a transient experience. Only for the soul is it true that love is your true nature, that love is the essence of who you are as consciousness itself. So only the soul truly understands this, that love is your true nature. And the ego misunderstands it. So there are many spiritual truths, but they're not true unless you're actually spiritually awake. They're not true for the ego. The ego might believe them in a good-hearted manner, but they're not true of the ego. And that's why when the ego tries to understand these spiritual truths, the ego misunderstands completely, with often disastrous results. You have all these egos going around saying, I am divine. You can imagine the mess that can be created very rapidly. So I hope my comments are clear about this. If you have any questions, please put your questions in the comments under this video, and I'll reply to them next week. So let's just quickly go through the 3 steps again. Notice, feel, and be. Notice attention has 2 poles. Feel, that means find that still point at the end of the in-breath. Feel that peaceful feeling there. And then step 3, be. Be that peaceful feeling. Allow the peace to go all over your body. Can you feel that? This is spiritual intelligence. You're now being consciousness itself, within which all your thoughts and emotions and perceptions arise. The world arises within your consciousness, and you are the consciousness. This is your spiritual intelligence. So here we are, from all over the world, gathered together right now, experiencing our spiritual intelligence together, simply being consciousness itself, aware of our thoughts and emotions, but not being them, and therefore having access to all the qualities and capabilities of the soul. So we do this practice together every week at the same time, Wednesdays at 12 noon GMT. And of course we meet together to experience spiritual intelligence for our own sake, but also for the sake of the entire world. Because the more of us that learn how to activate spiritual intelligence, the more we contribute to elevating world consciousness. So please do join us next week if you can. Wednesday, 12 noon GMT. And if you can't join us live, you can watch the video that will be on the SQ page after that. It's delightful, isn't it? Can you feel how delightful it is to simply be consciousness itself? And notice you can use this method, notice, feel, and be, in any situation. Even when you're in adverse circumstances, when you're, triggered by an ego reaction, anger, fear, sorrow, anxiety, you can simply notice, feel, and be, and immediately you're released from that ego reaction. Immediately you become consciousness itself. You may need to do the cycle a few times, notice, feel, and be, if the emotional reaction is particularly strong. So you may need to go through this cycle a few times, that's okay. But in a matter of seconds, you can free yourself from any emotional reaction. Even if it's a trauma magnified emotional reaction, you can still free yourself from it instantly by using the 3Q method. So I hope you'll prove this to yourself during the day. When you remember to, just use these 3 steps: notice, feel, and be. I often like to use it when I'm in a queue, waiting at the traffic lights or waiting in a supermarket to pay at the till. And usually the mind just goes into a sort of reverie, rehearsing thoughts and emotions at random for no good reason, just because you've got time to spare. Instead of that, instead of all that turmoil, instead of all that chaos, use your spiritual intelligence. Notice, feel, and be. And then you can enjoy the peace and love of your soul instead of the chaos and reactivity of your ego, of the thinking mind. Much better alternative, right? So do remember to experiment with this technique during the day and prove to yourself that the 3Q method is, in fact, sufficient to shift you from ego to soul and activate your spiritual intelligence. Okay, well, I'll leave it there for now, and I hope to see you again next week. Bye for now.